Hello, everyone. Greetings from IATA's offices here in Geneva. It's a pleasure to welcome you to these global media days that we're doing virtually over today and tomorrow. We have a very stellar lineup. Our Director General, Willie Walsh, is with us. We also have Ezgi Gulbas, our Senior Economist. Nick Kareen, Senior Vice President for Operations, Safety and Security, will be in the first session. And my name is Tony Concil. I'll be hosting it. I'm the Head of Communications here at IATA. As per normal, we will have a few short presentations, and that will be followed by an opportunity for questions and answers using the chat function. So please, as questions come to you, don't hesitate to put them into the chat function. So that we make the most of our time, let's get started promptly. So I'll turn it over to Ezgi to give us an overview of how she sees the current state of the industry's performance. Ezgi, over to you.
Thank you, Tony. Good day to everyone. In this presentation, we will show that there is some optimism about the airline industry, but there are also reasons to be cautious. If we could move to the next slide. First of all, good news is that air cargo business is very strong. In May, cargo ton volumes were 9.4% above pre-crisis levels, and we expect this trend to continue since the underlying economic fundamentals remain favorable for air cargo. As you see in this chart, the industrial production is growing and world goods trade reached to new high levels. In addition to these strong economic fundamentals, air cargo benefits from congestions in container supply chains as companies target to renew their inventories quickly to meet the rising demand with the strength in the global economy. This continued strength in cargo business provides some relief to the industry that is struggling with slow recovery on the passenger side. Next slide, please. There is a sharp rebound in consumer confidence, but this is not reflected into air travel demand. Global air travel measured by passenger kilometers flown, as shown by blue line in this chart, has been recovering since March. But the recovery is very slow, and global RPKs are still 62.7% down compared to their levels in May 2019. On the other hand, we have seen a very quick rebound in consumer confidence at the end of last year with the availability of vaccines. Normally, we would have expected this to be reflected in air travel demand. However, the travel restrictions are clearly limiting this to happen. Next slide, please. As you can see, there is a clear disparity between domestic and international travel. Domestic travel is recovering very fast, but international travel, shown by red line in this chart, is not following that. In May, we have seen slight improvements, but it is still very weak compared to where they were before the crisis. On the other hand, as I said, domestic passenger traffic remains strong and trends upwards. And this indicates us the willingness to travel and potential pent-up demand. Moving to the next slide. Let's take a look at details of domestic travel. Among main domestic markets shown by green line in this chart, China and Russia recovered above pre-crisis levels as the vaccine rollout is fast and virus is under control in these regions on those months. US domestic moving up with the successful vaccine rollout, and it is progressing towards full recovery to pre-pandemic levels, most likely to happen by the end of this year. And Brazil, we have seen lockdowns, restrictions last month, but following that, the domestic RPKs recovered very quickly. On the other hand, where the pandemic is again emerging, the cases are increasing, like India, Japan, the recovery is reverting. Having said that, US and China domestic markets make 2/3 of total domestic travel markets, and weakening in other small markets with relatively low share does not affect overall growth trends in domestic travel. Next slide, please. At the beginning of the presentation, I said there is a reason for optimism, and here in this chart you see bookings for future travel by booking date. Blue line shows domestic travel, and they remain very strong in June. On the international side, after almost 15 months of stability, we saw an increase from very low levels, shown in the red line. And this makes us optimistic about the pent-up demand. Once the travel restrictions are lifted, we think that we could see improvements in the pace of recovery on the international side as well. If we can move to the next slide. However, there are reasons that make us cautious as well. The main concern now is new COVID variants, which could cause a delay in opening of some markets. Globally, the number of new COVID cases has declined, but the share of new variants in total cases has been rising. And if we look at the public sentiment, which is based on Google search and shown in this chart, as you can see, the blue line shows the interest for flights, and there is a clear pickup since April. But COVID-19 variants are also taking attention and rising faster than the search for flights. So this makes us cautious about the recovery in demand. Next slide, please. Here is a very good example showing us that travel demand is very fragile. This chart shows the bookings from UK to Portugal. We have shown similar chart in our previous media call when UK included Portugal in its green list. At that time, daily bookings has jumped 30% above pre-COVID levels in a very short period of time. However, UK pulled Portugal out from the green list, and Portugal imposed new holiday quarantine rules. And as you can see in this chart, in a month, bookings turned to negative, meaning that cancellations are exceeding the new bookings. Hence, we see a pent-up demand for travel, but the situation could alter in a very short period of time depending on government policies. Next slide, please. While travel demand is fragile, the recovery in the second half is very critical for airline financials. As a final slide, I would like to show our cash burn estimates that we calculated back in April. We estimated that cash burn for the whole year 2021 to be $81 billion. And here in this chart with the blue bars, you see the quarterly profile. And this calculation was based on the assumption that there will be a limited recovery in the air travel in the first half. But since there is a pent-up demand in the second half of the year, some international markets will open and there will be a rebound in these markets. And based on this, we have been estimating industry cash burn to be reduced in the second half of this year. However, as we have seen in various examples, country examples, the recovery is very fragile depending on the government policies, despite the clear pent-up that we have been seeing. In addition to these, fuel prices are rising, which is also putting additional pressure on airlines' financials. Hence, the recovery in air travel demand with the ease of travel restrictions is crucial for airline industry in the second half of this year. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Ezgi. That was a really good overview of what's going on in the industry. For the journalists joining, a reminder that we will have very shortly the May figures for both passenger and cargo. That'll be distributed in a press release, so you have the background data for that presentation as well. I'd like now to turn to Willie Walsh, our Director General, to give us some context around how we see the restart shaping up. So, Willie, over to you.
Thank you, Tony, and good afternoon, everybody. Greetings from Geneva. We're now in what is traditionally the peak travel period in northern summer, and I think it's fair to say there's still quite some uncertainty out there. However, 1.5 years into this pandemic, we are making progress, particularly in relation to vaccinations, which I think will have a significant impact on the outlook for the second half, as Ezgi said in her presentation a few minutes ago. There are a few issues that continue to frustrate us, and these are probably best covered by talking of the government, where we're seeing little evidence of plans being disclosed in a timely fashion and in a transparent way on border reopening to enable international flying. Now, while we'll welcome any move by governments, it would be very helpful for the industry to at least have some indication as to when these changes are likely to happen, so that we can avoid the confusion and issues that we witnessed in the US, where the industry wasn't able to match capacity with demand as they tried to rebuild their networks in the domestic market. So advance notice of any border openings would be very helpful. We're also seeing little evidence of coordination at a government level, and this is probably best. The best example is if you look at the EU, despite the efforts of the Commission, we're seeing a wide variation in the requirements for things like testing. And even more recently, we've seen, I think, 10 different approaches to the digital COVID certificate. And clearly, this is causing great confusion in the minds of consumers. And finally, very clear that governments are not basing their decision on medical and scientific data. Why do we have a situation where the UK and the US is not open despite very high levels of vaccination in both countries? Why is Canada open to vaccinated Canadian citizens but not to vaccinated European citizens? And why are we seeing measures being taken in Australia and Argentina to significantly restrict the number of passengers that can enter the country? It's very clear that the scientific medical data would support a much more relaxed environment. And as you've heard me say on many occasions, the risk environment we're operating in today is significantly different to what we were dealing with 18 months ago. Now, you've heard me talk about what should happen and expressing the views of the industry. But what we thought we might do today is give you the views of the consumer. As you know, we do quite a bit of consumer research. So if we look at the latest data, and this is where we've spoken to 4,700 consumers in 11 different markets, including the big markets like the US, Canada, UK, Australia, Japan, etc. So the information here is, I think, very interesting. And the first being that 2/3 of people really miss flying and believe that it is impacting on their quality of life. And this is for various different reasons. You can see both personal and business. On the personal side, it's the inability to meet with their family and friends, or missing key life events, weddings, funerals, family occasions. So this is having a big impact on a personal level and on the business level. Despite the technological advances like we're using today, Teams and Zoom, etc., we're still seeing a lot of business people express concern and frustration about not being able to deal with their professional colleagues. If we move on to the next slide, this is a positive indication of people who have recently flown. So 57% of people surveyed have travelled since 1 June last year, so in the last 12 months. And you see very high figures there, 89% indicating that they thought the protective measures were well implemented and that the measures made them feel safe on board. And this reinforces our view that, flying itself is a safe activity. However, there are frustrations, and these are, probably best explained by consumers who are saying that the rules are very difficult to understand. And I speak from personal experience. As an experienced flyer, I found that myself, trying to figure out what rules you have to comply with, testing regime, when you have to do it. This is clearly a major frustration. The hassle of doing COVID tests is a problem, and the cost is a very significant issue, where you can see there's 61% of people saying the cost is likely to deter them from travelling again. And we have seen plenty of evidence to support our view that the cost of these tests should either be borne by the government, as recommended by the WHO, or should be significantly reduced, because the pricing that we have witnessed is way in excess of the cost of any of these tests. So if I move on, the good news is that people who have flown feel safe and feel secure. The bad news is that, quite a number of people say that they will return to flying soon, and supporting our view that the pent-up demand exists. So almost 2/3 of people have said that, they'll not wait at all, or they'll start flying in a couple of months, with 85% of people saying within 6 months. Now, I think this is probably overly pessimistic, because the evidence, again shown in the slides that Ezgi showed you, is that when the restrictions are removed, there is an immediate response from consumers. But those responses are being heavily influenced by the restrictions and by the fears that people have of new restrictions being introduced. And if we move on to the next slide, and this is probably supported best by this, where people have said that if there is a chance that they'll have to quarantine at their destination, then that's likely to strongly discourage them from flying. And again, that's supported by the data that we've seen from bookings. It doesn't seem as strong for people returning from their destination, but the idea of having to travel somewhere and go into quarantine is definitely deterring people from making the decision to travel. And what we believe here is that there is a much better way of doing this. Quarantine is not necessary if the data is followed. And you've heard us talk about data from the UK. We've updated that with the very latest information, which is a slight change in the way they used to present it, where they gave the numbers of passengers tested. They're now giving details of the numbers of tests taken by those passengers. And you can see almost 1.3 million coronavirus PCR tests since the system was introduced back in February of this year through to the 9th of June of this year. And the real strong take from this data is that the vast majority of people who have travelled and have taken tests on their return are completely safe. 98.4% showed no evidence of coronavirus having undertaking tests on their return. Only 1.6% of people tested positive. And again, if you extract the data from the red list countries, and particularly the ones that were identified as very high risk, Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, who account for about 10% of the total tests, but over 34% of the positives, the situation is much more encouraging. Now, significantly, when we looked at the data for the latest 3 weeks, so this is up to the 9th of June, 3 weeks up to the 9th of June, the positivity rate was 0.5%. So the trend has been improving the whole way through this. So in that period, 20th of May to the 9th of June, the positivity rate was 0.5%. And that compares to the general positivity rate in the UK of 2.2%. And when you consider that the WHO talk about a positivity rate of less than 5 being an indication of the pandemic coming under control, you can see that the risk here is extremely low and can be mitigated by more sensible measures. So we believe governments need to take a much more open approach to risk management. And we can move on to the next slide. This is actually supported by some of the data that we'll see here as well. People are frustrated by the restrictions that are in place. 63% of people indicating that they're frustrated. But more importantly, what we're seeing now is that wide acceptance of the fact that we're going to have to live with this virus. It's not going to disappear. As many governments have now indicated, we can tame it, but we can't eliminate it. Now, there are still some governments who are pursuing a zero COVID approach, but quite honestly, all of the scientific data that we see supports the view that we're going to have to adapt our lives to live with this virus. And the vast majority of people are accepting that. There's also general acceptance to the need to reopen borders. I think the key here again will be the measures that governments can put in place to support the vaccination. And where vaccination is not possible, sensible measures on testing. But you can see here 85% of people say there needs to be a balance between managing the risk of COVID and reopening borders. And we've been arguing this for some time. And I think there's very strong general support for the view that this is the case. So the key, as we said, will be vaccination. We recognise that there's no zero risk approach to this, and therefore what we have to do is take a managed risk approach. And if we can move on to the next slide. There's a willingness here to see their borders reopening. The majority of people, 2/3, believe that the borders should either be open completely or should be open to most countries. So what we're seeing is evidence that the scientific evidence supports the fact that the virus is coming under control. The data supports the fact that the risk associated with international travel is extremely low. The consumer data supports the view that people are willing to adapt to living with this and recognise that sensible measures can be put in place to minimise and mitigate any net risk that exists. And, more and more we're seeing evidence now of people recognising that having a balance between protecting people against the virus and getting on with their lives and supporting livelihoods is the right approach to be adopted. And the next slide. This, what I've been saying, vaccination, not just for the individuals where 81% of people say they're more likely to travel if they've been vaccinated, but 78% of people saying that people who are, 75% of people saying that people who are vaccinated should be able to travel without further restriction. But also a recognition that we can't just have a system for people who are vaccinated. We also need to allow for people who either can't be vaccinated or haven't had the opportunity to be vaccinated to be able to travel. And this is where a sensible testing regime comes into play. And if we move on, we'll see that the vast majority of people are willing to undergo testing. But again, as we've said before, it's the cost and the inconvenience of testing that's discouraging people. The vast majority, 78%, of people believe that governments should bear the cost in line with WHO guidelines, particularly when the argument is that this is being done for health risk purposes. If we have a situation where the vaccine rollout continues, people are prepared to share their data of vaccination because they recognise that a simple digital way of complying or demonstrating compliance with the requirements is the best way forward. And very strong support for a mobile app to enable them to store their health credentials and to share it at their request with people, either the airlines or governments, but with 89% of people being likely to store their data that way and to share it with airlines and governments. And this supports very strongly the work that we're doing in relation to the IATA travel pass. So on that note, I'll pass over to Nick Careen, who will take you through a presentation on the IATA travel pass.
Great.